Hello to those of you who are here in person in Psychs 255A and B. Today is kind of a bittersweet day. This is the final presentation in the Spring 2023 Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar. And as always, we've been looking forward to our speaker's presentation, but we cannot say that there are any more upcoming presentations this semester. There will be, of course, in the fall 2023 semester. So keep your subscriptions to the Office of Sustainability's email bulletin up to date. With that, I will simply say thank you. First to our co-sponsors of this series. I am Brad Flam, the Director of the Office of Sustainability, and we co-sponsor this series with our colleagues in the Office for Research and Sponsored Programs, and with the Sustainability Council's Scholarly and Creative Activities Committee. Also, thank you to our colleagues at New Street Catering, who have kept the coffee and cookies and teas here in 255A-B Psychs fueled throughout the semester. Thank you to Amy Maxey, who has provided excellent Zoom room management and promotion, and all of the team in our Office of Sustainability who has promoted these events over the semester. And finally, thanks to all of the speakers this semester. We'll be putting out some messaging in the coming days to thank all of them. And thank you especially to Professor Aliza Richman, who is joining us today, and to whom I am now ceding the digital floor.
Thank you, Brad. So thank you for joining the talk today, for those of you that are here and for those of you who are on Zoom. I will share my screen just so that we're all on the same page here and then get started with the talk. So let me see. Let's make this. Okay, and slideshow. Okay, so folks on Zoom, does that everything look perfect to you? Yeah.
Looks good, Aliza.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this talk is going to be an overview of a primary data collection project called the Sustainability Census that was conducted during the fall 2022 semester. I am Aliza Richman. I'm an associate professor of sociology. I'm also the chair of the Sustainability Council here at Westchester. So I will move through the presentation. If there's any clarifying questions that you have, please don't hesitate to ask those in real time. But I hope that we can do Q&A if there's bigger questions afterwards. So as some background, the Sustainability Census is this primary data survey data collection project that's originated well before fall 2022, but the data collection happened during the fall 2022 semester. There's a IRB approved questionnaire for the Sustainability Census that was developed that spanned 4 central categories, and they are sustainable actions, beliefs and risk perceptions, knowledge and literacy, background and demographics. The survey was made available to everyone at Westchester University, so all students, faculty, staff, and administrators through Qualtrics. The primary mode of essentially acquiring respondents was emails through Qualtrics, but we also had some great help from, for example, the sustainability peer educators, working for tabling and just trying to get folks to take the survey on the spot. This project was also helped in with support and funding by the Campus Sustainability Research and Creative Activity Grant. So I just wanted to honor that and thank them for the support. So who responded? Overall, about an estimated 11 to 12% of the Westchester community responded. And of course, this project had very ambitious goals, being called the Census. We were looking for a high level and high degree of completion among the Westchester community. So of the 10 to 11 or 11 to 12% of the campus population that responded, we had about 1,900 respondents that fully completed the survey. This varied by role on campus. So we see overwhelmingly the majority of the respondents were students, about 78%, just under 10% were faculty, 11% were staff, and administrators just came under 2% of the sample population. Overwhelmingly, the sample is predominantly from the United States, which makes sense given that we're a state school. By gender, we see a majority of the respondents were female, about 67%. However, aligning this with the demographics of Westchester University as a whole, as reported from institutional research, we see about 60% of our student demographic is female. So this does not include faculty, staff, or administrators. So we still see a little bit of a disproportionate number of, or a higher proportion of female respondents than male respondents. However, it's not too far skewed from the reflection of our student body. And by race and ethnicity, we also see that by the institutional research data, it estimates around 23% of the student body are students of color. And that roughly aligns with the breakdown by race and ethnicity that we saw with the sustainability census respondents. About 3% were Asian or Asian American, about 6% were Black or African only, about 76% were white only, and about 3% were Hispanic or Latino or Latina, and about 8% were more than one race or ethnicity. In the coming works, I hope to get a little bit more precise in terms of the more than one race category, because I have that level of precision. But for these analyses, the more than one race category will stand as is, knowing that it could be a combination of any of the race and ethnicities listed here. So the first part of the data that I want to review with you all is about sustainable actions. And to be able to understand sustainable actions and what is happening on campus related to sustainable actions, we had a really high response rate for these set of questions, given that they also happened earlier in the survey. So we saw attrition happen through the survey as folks took time to take it. Survey lasted approximately 10, 12 minutes to take. So the earlier section of the questions, we had a higher response rate than the later set of the questions. So with this, we asked respondents, during the last calendar year, how often do you act in the following ways? And you'll notice that each of these 12 behaviors that are listed here, these 12 sustainable actions, are rank ordered. They're ranked ordered in the frequency with which our respondents, the sample here at Westchester, again, students, faculty, staff, and administrators, engage in these actions. The index as a whole combines all 12 of these measures to look at this as a conglomerate. And so as a result, the Sustainable Actions Index is a scale that includes all 12 of these indicators of sustainable activity. So we can go through them a little bit more closely. We see that the behavior that our community is most likely to engage in is reducing energy usage. We see about 80% usually or always engage in this activity. Carefully sorting waste by recycling or using compost bins, about 73% usually or always could perform this behavior. Minimize or avoid unnecessary air travel, that's about 73%. And this, I'm really curious what will happen. The sustainability census, I should also mention, is a longitudinal project, with this being our first wave of data collection. And so I'm curious about the pandemic effect on the avoiding and minimizing unnecessary air travel, especially in the last year when we saw a lot of restrictions in place, and especially with Westchester University posing restrictions on travel for work, for instance. and limiting study abroad opportunities, that this might be more heavily influenced by the pandemic. And so this will be an indicator that will be very interesting to look at in future iterations of the survey. Avoiding purchasing bottled water by consuming water from bulk sources, about 70% engaged in the activity. And then we start to see a drop off. Conserving paper, about 57%. Acting to reduce waste, 56%. Conserving water, 53%. Choosing sustainable transportation, even further drop off there, about 33%. And interestingly, the dietary choices to choose to make sustainable decisions through your diet, about a quarter of the sample usually or always makes decisions about their diet with sustainability in mind. And this relates to making dietary choices for sustainability reasons and also eating less meat and following a plant-based diet. Then we see the last two are engaging in activity because it's sustainability related focus, about 12%, and then going to Gordon or other green spaces, about 9%. So there's a whole fluctuation here of engagement in sustainable actions. And so I just ordered this in this way, just so we were able to get an idea of what behaviors folks are more likely to engage in. I also want to draw your attention to number 3, and then the dietary choices, which are related to 9 and 10, because research has shown that these are ways that individuals can have the biggest impact when examining their own footprint is through air travel and diet in terms of reducing your footprint. So we might want to see a little bit of an increase over time in folks making dietary choices, for instance, that keeps sustainability in mind, because we know that that can be more impactful than, say, like conserving paper for an overall footprint. All are good activities, but we can look at these in terms of their impact as well. So when we look at the sustainable action index, again, the summative index of all of those 12 different actions, we look at the number of respondents, and this is on the y-axis. And then we look at, on the x-axis, how frequently folks engage in these behaviors. So again, we're really looking, how often do folks engage in sustainable actions on campus? And we're seeing that the majority of respondents occasionally to usually engage in sustainable actions, but only about 10% of respondents usually or always engage in sustainable actions. So the majority of folks are essentially doing some work, and we can see which types of activities based on the previous slide that they're more inclined to be doing, but that we would ideally like to see this bell curve shift towards the right on my screen, should be hopefully the right on everyone's screen, where we move folks out of the occasionally category into the usually, from the usually to the always, and certainly from the never or the rarely over towards the occasional. So just thinking about some increases that some room for improvement. Okay. So the second question then is, how much has your sustainable behaviors increased at Westchester? So what effect does being on campus have on your sustainable behaviors? And 44% of respondents report that their engagement in sustainable behaviors did not change or grew a little since being at WCU. So certainly this is a sizable proportion of our respondents, and definitely also an indicator that we have some room for improvement and some ability to think about how we might want to intervene with sustainable behaviors on campus to make them more accessible, to make them easier, to make them structurally more feasible. On the flip side, we are seeing that about a quarter of our respondents have really engaged with sustainable behaviors since they're being on campus at Westchester. And that's fantastic. So we're seeing that about a quarter of respondents say that their engagement in sustainable behaviors grew a lot or a great deal while being at Westchester. And essentially, we want to bring more folks into this category. So there's a lot of room for more growth to be happening. Again, this idea of shifting towards the right. However, if we then look at intention and desire, the overwhelming majority of the sample wish to live more sustainably. So about just under 90% of the respondents would either agree or strongly agree that they would like to live more sustainably. And this is excellent because this demonstrates that the desire to live more sustainably is on campus. And so this points to opportunity, accessibility, knowledge, awareness, and also implementing a structure that makes sustainability and living sustainably the easiest choice to be able to bring folks up to aligning their desire with their actions. And then we can look at the climate crisis and impressions of the climate crisis. And we overwhelmingly see that the climate crisis is urgent and I must take action now. Again, a very high proportion of respondents want to take action because they're aware of the urgency of the climate crisis. It's about 84% of respondents either agree or strongly agree that the climate crisis is urgent and they must take action now. This is also excellent. So what we're seeing here is we have a population that really is desiring action. However, there's a slight disconnect between the behaviors that they're engaging in and their desire to do so. And finally, thinking more broadly about this, thinking outside of what do I want to do for myself, but what do I hope Westchester does? So I wish for Westchester to take more action to address sustainability in the climate crisis. 70% of respondents wish for Westchester to take more action to address sustainability in the climate crisis. And interestingly, we start to see some variation if we look at this by role on campus. About 70% of students, about 75% of faculty who are overwhelmingly the most likely to want Westchester to take more action to address sustainability in the climate crisis. Staff around 73% and administrators around 72%. And so we'll get into these numbers and what can underpin them in a little bit. But overwhelmingly, there's a desire for more individual action, as well as a desire for more institutional action. So the second part is related to beliefs and risk perception. So to understand beliefs and risk perception, some of those questions on the sustainability census were pulled directly from the Yale program on climate change communications. And this allowed for us to be able to understand how does Westchester as a community compare nationally, because the Yale program on climate communications runs a nationally representative survey repeatedly. So the last one that they ran was in 2021, and so fairly recent, and we can compare our responses on these questions to national responses, also averages within Pennsylvania and averages within Chester County. And this is all based on the Yale climate data. So the percent of respondents at Westchester that believe global warming is happening is 92%. And this is immensely higher than the national average of 72%, the Pennsylvania average, which is under the national average of 70%, but the Chester County average of 77%. There's a few reasons why we would expect this to be the case. We're an institution of higher education. Generally speaking, when we're looking at national averages, we're looking at folks from all demographic backgrounds. With higher educational attainment typically comes higher levels of knowledge. And then so as a result, higher levels of trust in science. And so we would then expect and hope that we would see Westchester being a little bit higher than average. But here it's exceedingly higher than average, which is excellent. Global warming is caused mostly by human activities. Nationally, this is about 57%. And I will just say that for those of you who are kind of shaking your head at the national data, this crossed over the 50% mark in the last few years since 2019, and that's a big deal. So folks correctly attributing the cause of global warming to human activities, and then having the majority of the national population being able to do so is a step in the right direction. The trends are all positive, but again, yes, I understand some frustration if you look at this and say nationally, how is it that we only have, a Heinz ketchup number of folks suggesting that global warming is caused by human activities. But here at Westchester, 84% correctly attribute global warming's causes to human activities. And we do see a lot of variation there, with administration being the lowest at 77% correctly attributing human activity as the cause of global warming. But among faculty, 96% are there, and then students fall in the middle, and so do staff, 83 and 84% respectively. Most scientists think global warming is happening. Nationally, that's 57%. At Westchester, we see 73%. So, okay, we're getting here. We're not seeing that same Westchester exceptionalism, that positive exceptionalism that we've seen in the last few questions. But there is great variation here. And among faculty who are teaching our students, we're seeing that, again, 94% are correctly attributing or correctly acknowledging that there's a high degree of consensus among scientists that global warming is happening. We see that staff and students are in the 70s there, and so that there can really suggest that there's room for educational improvement and knowledge, especially among students and staff in regard to this category. And then finally, global warming is affecting the weather. And here we again see this Westchester exceptionalism taking place. So then we get into more risk perception. How worried are you about global warming? And about 87% of respondents are somewhat or very worried about global warming. And comparing this to the Yale Climate Opinions Map, we see that nationally, this is about 65% of folks nationally are very worried about global warming. And this is here at Westchester, we're 87%, so it's much higher. And so this is also a really good indicator that folks at Westchester wish to live more sustainably, but also recognize the threats of global warming to our population. So then the question is how much has your knowledge, given that we're an institution of higher education, how much has your knowledge of sustainability grown at Westchester? And unfortunately, we're not seeing as, to me, and especially working with students and educating for sustainability on a regular basis, on the plus side, we're seeing about a quarter of respondents say that their level of sustainability grew a lot or a great deal at Westchester. But on the flip of that, we're seeing just under 50%, about 46% of respondents report that their level of sustainable knowledge did not change or grew a little since being at Westchester. So this really suggests that there's still a really big population of folks that could benefit from sustainable education, and we could really do think about planning interventions that would be able to help grow knowledge of sustainability here at Westchester. And then we have this intermediate category that says that 29% of respondents say that their level of sustainable knowledge grew a moderate amount while at Westchester. And I think that that's pretty positive too. But the idea here is that we want to, again, shift these cells to the right. So moving on to part 3 here, which is knowledge and literacy. Again, I created an index called the Literacy Index. This is a composite measure, and it's comprised of 15 questions that have correct answers. So survey respondents were asked, for example, what's the definition of sustainability? And out of a multiple choice, 4 different responses, they had to select the correct response. The topics related to this literacy assessment relate to sustainability, sources of renewable energy, the greenhouse effect, environmental economics, environmental impacts, waste disposal, wealth inequality, environmental and social justice, and plastics and recycling. So really trying to understand the social, economic, and environmental components of sustainability, and to assess our respondents' knowledge and literacy of sustainability as a whole. So when we comprise these 15 questions, we see that a score of 0 would indicate low sustainability literacy, and 15 demonstrates high literacy and sustainability. So the max score that you could receive on this literacy assessment would be a 15. And when we're looking at literacy, we do see a skewed distribution, which is excellent because it's skewed towards the higher index scores. But the average number of correct responses, and this is again out of 15, was 10.5. And so that's about 70%. So our literacy as a campus, or as the sample, is about a C- right now, in terms of how we might rank ourselves. We can then further examine sustainability literacy by role on campus. And when we do this, we see that among our student population, the average correct response was a 10. And so the students correctly were answered 10 out of the 15 questions. That's about a 66%. So that would be about a D score on the sustainability literacy among students. Faculty scored the highest on the literacy assessment at 12.6. That's about an 84%, so about a B average there. However, faculty, if we further examine this, faculty in the College of Science and Mathematics scored the highest among all faculty in any college, and they correctly answered 13.5 out of the 15 questions, which is about 90%. Staff and administrators were equivalent here in terms of correctly identifying on average around 11.8 questions, and that's about a C+. So here we see, in terms of sustainability literacy and being able to correctly answer questions about sustainability, that there's great variation. We see certainly faculty within the College of Science and Mathematics are leading the charge on campus with their level of literacy related to sustainability, but there's certainly a lot of improvement, certainly among our student population, and I would even, love to see our staff and administrative population raise up as a whole and eliminate these disparities that exist among the different faculty and colleges on campus as well. Now we can also examine the sustainability literacy assessment by race and ethnicity. And here I did a little very an analysis of variance. So looking for statistical significance across the different means. And what we end up seeing, and this is the entire sample, so still including students, faculty, staff, and administrators, is that there are racial and ethnic disparities in sustainability literacy on account of race and ethnicity. And this is an area where, when we think about, for example, equity and social equity, that we need to also think about how we focus our efforts. But there are disparities and observable and statistically significant disparities. So on average, non-Hispanic Blacks scored 2.4 points lower on the sustainability literacy assessment than non-Hispanic whites. The Hispanic population here at Westchester scored on average 2.1 points lower on the sustainability assessment, literacy assessment, than non-Hispanic whites. So we're seeing some racial and ethnic disparities here in sustainability literacy that we should be intentional about addressing. And the last part is about background and demographics. And the last bit about background and demographics, I was really interested in understanding among our student population, how much time, where are students at when they arrive on campus? So how much time have students spent formally learning about sustainability in high school? And the majority, 61.4% of students, have spent 1 week or less formally learning about sustainability, the climate crisis, and/or global warming before arriving on campus. And if we couple this with how much has your knowledge of sustainability grown while being at Westchester, we're seeing two things. One is that majority of students are entering with a week or less of formal education on sustainability before arriving here at Westchester, and about 44% of respondents are suggesting, and this is not a precise comparison because the 44% includes beyond students, the faculty and staff and administrators as well. But about 44% would suggest that their knowledge of sustainability has grown either a little or not at all since being on campus. So we need to be examining these two things together. And we have to understand that the majority of our students are coming into our classrooms not well versed in sustainability. Among faculty, staff, and administrators, a similar question, but tailored to this group, was asked. And this was about the time spent formally learning about sustainability. And so this could be in a workshop, in a conference setting, in a seminar, in a program of study. And about 48.1% of current staff have not spent any formal time learning about sustainability. 46% of administrators have spent 1 day or less formally learning about sustainability, and about 23.5% of faculty have spent multiple years learning about sustainability. So we're seeing here a big chasm emerge among certainly about a quarter of our faculty have spent multiple years addressing sustainability. We can imagine that this relates to their graduate studies and potential areas of professional employment as well. However, there's among current staff and among administrators, we're seeing that there are really big gaps in terms of ability or having access to formal areas of education about sustainability. And these might be areas of intervention as well. So to summarize this wealth of data, I think that there's really a tale of two stories. And the first story is that only about a quarter of the sample states that their knowledge of sustainability and level of sustainable behaviors has grown at Westchester. The majority of students are entering Westchester with 1 week or less of formal education on sustainability, and most faculty, staff, and administrators demonstrate need for formal sustainability education. We also observe statistically significant disparities in sustainability literacy observed by role on campus, that would be student, faculty, staff, or administrator, as well as by race and ethnicity. So there's certainly equity issues that we need to be able to address here too. The second story is really about desire and intention and what the hope for the future looks like. And the majority of Westchester respondents want to live more sustainably, are concerned about global warming, and want Westchester to take more actions to address sustainability in the climate crisis. The respondents' risk perceptions of the climate crisis exceed local, state, and national risk perceptions. And so putting these two together, the moral would suggest that there's a strong desire for increased sustainable action on campus and a need for greater exposure to sustainable education at WCU. And so looking at both of these, it demonstrates that on one hand, there's a lot of work to be done. And on the second hand, there's a demonstrated good contingent of the sample that is more than desiring for the increase in sustainable action, an increased desire to live sustainably, and an increased desire for Westchester to take actions institutionally to address the climate crisis as well. So with that, I am happy to open this up to comments and questions. I'm sorry, I've been ignoring the chat while I've been chiming along. So I can start addressing some of the questions here in the chat, or we can start with voice questions.
Like to do it.
So, okay. Were there questions about automobile travel? Not specifically related to automobile travel. The questions were related more to, I shouldn't say that. There's questions about, trying to remember, living on campus or off campus, but there weren't specific questions related to automobile travel. That is not something that we asked about. What is the racial census of WCU? I would think most of who is concerned about sustainability are minorities. Some of those 44% might have already been acting sustainably before coming to WCU. So I did actually look a little bit into the demographics of looking at the Sustainable Action Index by race and ethnicity, and more or less, you don't see great variation by race and ethnicity based on sustainable action. So that was something that I looked into, and because there was just very little variation there, I didn't report on it. But that is a good question and a really good point to address in terms of what's going on there. For the next census, could there be a question about why global warming worries us? Answers could be home, children, animals, etc. Perhaps it can be open-ended. So certainly we can ask why global warming worries us. That could be an interesting assessment. Any survey, and it's certainly a huge, massive survey that's going up to hundreds and thousands of people. I worry about open-ended questions, and any survey that is, because that would essentially require somebody to read thousands of responses and then to be able to code them. And that just is, from a quantitative perspective, very, very challenging to do. And any survey is a measure, and I worked with Brad with this extensively when we were creating the survey, but is an editing feat, right? You want to ask the important questions. You want to figure out, there's so many questions that we could ask that we would love to have information and data on. And the challenge is, how do we create a survey that will be able to touch on multiple issues in a meaningful way, but not exhaust our respondents, right? And so hovering around that 10-minute mark was a challenging thing to do. And so there's a lot of good survey questions that ended up on the cutting room floor just because of that balance. Do you think literacy disparities have to do with education before university? So that's an excellent question. And that's actually some of the work that I'm starting to get into, is looking at that. So there is a positive association for students. So students who have spent more time studying sustainability before coming in high school have scored higher on the sustainability literacy assessment. And the same is true among faculty, staff, and administrators. Those faculty, staff, and administrators who have spent more time formally learning about sustainability have then scored higher on the sustainability literacy assessment. So there is that positive association that we can see between education and having passed formal education and their score on the literacy assessment. So that's excellent. And that's going to be something that I'll dive into in terms of future analyses. For faculty and staff, could the disparities be in relation to availability, time, and not to proximity? I'm not sure what is meant by proximity. Christian, do you want to unmute and explain?
Sure. When I say proximity, I actually mean like location. Like the reason they can't go to any of these like places, to whether it be online or in person, it's not because they're too far away or difficult to access, but rather it's because they don't have the time to do that. They have to focus on their jobs, their duties.
That's a really important question. And I think it speaks to a lot of some of the work of how do we align folks' professional job roles with sustainability, right? Like it shouldn't be one or the other. If you're coming to this campus and you're hired on this campus, sustainability should be part of your job. And so what you're highlighting is essentially an issue where we have this disconnect, right? Can you take time to go to the Brandywine project for staff? Will your boss let you? If it's outside of your job description, and certainly I know folks that have been staff and are very active and involved in the Sustainability Council, but they do so because of their personal commitment to sustainability, not because it's part of their job description. And that is an issue, right? So if you have folks that are essentially, it's not part of their job description to go to a sustainability workshop or to learn about this, then what incentive do you have to propel people to gain this education? So I do think that we are so far, I would imagine we're capturing a lot of the interested folks, but we're not necessarily capturing a lot of the folks that might think like, hey, sustainability is like not my thing. It doesn't relate to the job I do. When in reality, I'm sure we can all come up with a lot of different ways that sustainability would be related to a whole host of all jobs on campus. So that would be an important next step, is to really think about how does sustainability get written into job descriptions so that we don't see this disconnect, and that something like attending a sustainability workshop would be something that would be in line with your professional, job role. Sean.
I have so many questions. I'm going to try to boil it down. I'm wondering,
Would you mind? That way
Yeah.
Eliza won't have to repeat it.
Yeah,
Or maybe you could sit right there.
I can sit.
yeah, sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Eliza doesn't.
No, that's no problem.
So, well, I was first curious about the literacy piece. And so when we think about the sustainability academic program at Westchester being relatively new
Mhm.
and not being on the books for, I think Cheryl can speak to this more than I can, but I want to say it's only been about a year that it's been available
Mhm.
to enroll. So what I was so curious about is, those are great questions to ask, but I wonder if you had waited an academic year for students to enroll in those courses and learn more about even just the introduction level of what sustainability is, would you see a variance in the data? Would the awareness and knowledge be higher than asking these questions in the very early stages of implementing the minor program? And then attaching onto that is, does it beg the question that the sustainability intro 100 class should be, if it's not already, part of a gen ed required class versus an elective?
Yeah, so Cheryl just wrote, we're at the end of our second year. And the way I would respond to that about the minor is that while it hasn't formally been, we're in the end of the second year, the courses that are like in large part core to, well, I shouldn't say that all the courses, but the intro to sustainability and resilience is one of the core required courses. And I believe that has 30 seats and was only offered for the first time this past fall. And hopefully it'll be again offered in the spring. But the other competencies, like I'm thinking other courses that are electives in the program, have been offered for multiple years. So they're not brand new courses. So I'd say there's a difference between, for example, enrollment in the minor, and hopefully we do see that begins to grow, but that the network of sustainability focused classes, the intention behind the Brandywine Project for Faculty has been to essentially integrate sustainability into such a smattering of classes all around campus that hopefully that any student graduating from the university would have some exposure to sustainability, because just more or less there's been so many courses that have gone through the Brandywine Project at this point. So I think that there's a level of certainly, hopefully the minor brings more attention and we could see the literacy go up there. But I think that some of this is telling too, because we do have a whole host of courses, and Brad would be able to tell us from the STARS report about just how many courses we have on campus that are sustainability focused, and that the minor just harnessed and put them together rather than creating all these new courses. And it certainly created 2 new courses, but yeah.
And then I just had another quick question about this is such great data, and I know it's not even necessarily representative, excuse me, of the Westchester population as a whole. But when we think about the PASHE system, were you aware of other PASHE schools doing similar work? I'd like to see this be a domino effect to where we could look at the entire PASHE system and have some reflective data of what the knowledge is based on the criteria of the survey.
Yeah, well, I think that's certainly a good, I have not heard of anything. And
It's
so
a long-term
Brad,
goal.
no, but Brad and I are on the Sustainability Development Task Force at the PASHE level. So we interact with other PASHE institutions, and I've not heard this project along these lines come up. But there is a lot of information sharing happening among institutions. And so this could be a project that would be able to get elevated to, a PASHE level in future iterations as well. Now that we have the survey and we understand what's going on with it. So this is certainly a great idea to be able to understand, variation in knowledge across PASHE institutions would be a really interesting question as well. But yeah, we do not have that, and I'm not aware of any other of the PASHE schools that are doing that type of work at the moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Okay, Nico, are there any plans to increase the respondents for the second wave to make it closer to a Definitive census. Yes, and I would be open to hearing as many ideas in terms of how do you increase survey responses on campus. From my understanding, we did pretty well getting around that like 11-12% mark. Notoriously speaking, it's just been very, very challenging to get folks to take surveys on campus. And so there's just a survey fatigue element happening. And so one thing that I do want to do, and I have not done this yet either, is contact institutional research for the demographics of our from the fall 2022 demographics of our population, because what I can do is add survey weights to this data, and then with the survey weights added, it'll correct for, it'll essentially, when I implement the survey weights and run analyses on the data, it'll be representative of the Westchester population as a whole. And so that is something that I think is really important to do, just so that the sample doesn't have a selection effect, speaking to those who might be more inclined to open an email, see a questionnaire about the sustainability census, be more inclined to answer it. But we can start to look at this in terms of the demographics and making sure that essentially it's weighted correctly so we can see how this looks. But this presentation really only relates to the sample that answered the questionnaire, and there's a lot of different reasons why we might think about a selection effect of who would be more likely to answer a questionnaire on sustainability.
I feel like we're remiss if I didn't share this. Just one of the ways I was successful with collecting signatures for the Green Fund is networking, collaborating with professors, and that allowed me access to their classes. And it was incredible how successful it was with just a short presentation. Now, it would be great to network within the network faculty that are part of the council already, even in Westchester as a whole, where you could target it maybe early on in the semester where things aren't so crazy, and literally dedicate class time and say, hey, we're going to do this, and that's going to be just an integrated part of this course, because the data, as we know, it's really useful data. But networking, the timing of it, I think, is really key. But even for professors to be willing to dedicate a short amount of class time, say, we're going to take 15 minutes, and then have a survey that is about that long or less, and you might see a higher response.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so I think that's a great idea. Sean was just suggesting more partnerships with faculty to be able to get class time to do it. So yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea. And I think that in general, there's a lot, doing a campus-wide survey and doing this survey for the first time, there's a lot of identification of like different access points and trying to understand what we can do better in the future and how we can relate to this. So we see a question here about what about informal education on sustainability? I never has any formal education, but I'm fairly knowledgeable from informal things like this presentation. So that would certainly come up in the literacy assessment. So your literacy assessment would then suggest that okay, so the way I would look at that is that no, we did not ask any questions about informal education. And in part, what that would suggest to me is that if you were informally educated about sustainability and scored really high on the literacy assessment, then we wouldn't see this positive correlation that we see about formal education. And if this was a more widespread phenomenon, I should say, we wouldn't see this positive association that we see about formal, education about sustainability in high school, or formal training in a workshop or an education setting for faculty, staff, and administrators, and a positive effect on the literacy index score. So I think that it's a really good point that folks can learn about sustainability from a wide range of different factors. And if that was happening, we would just see that, hey, you know what? Formal education doesn't appear to have a relationship with the literacy index. And so that might tell us that folks are really getting their information more informally, and it's reliable, and it's, good information that folks are getting. But we're not seeing that. So there does seem to be this positive relationship that is reliant on formal education. Not saying that folks can't informally educate themselves, but just that we're not seeing that we're seeing a strong relationship here exist between the formal education factors and the literacy index.
I think that's a really important question, because even here at about the most formal of formal institutions of education, higher education that Westchester University is, we still have an emphasis on experiential learning through study abroad, through spring break trips. We have this new co-curricular transcript program. There are opportunities like these. There are a lot of informal opportunities, many of which are more accessible to faculty and staff than the formal classes that our students take. So it might be interesting to include a question about where's the source of your, what are the sources of your information about sustainability?
That we do have background in that. There's like in the last calendar year, have you attended a sustainability council meeting? Have you done a sustainability focus activity? And so there is that data that we can look into, some of those informal sustainability activities that are taking place on campus and what their activity level has been for that. I'm a little just angry at Qualtrics with how they give their data, like how the survey data was collected, and it's very, very messy. And so that variable itself is just super messy and didn't have time to unmessify it before this presentation, but that's the formal term for it.
Aliza, we are a little bit past 12:50, and we often pause at this point in case people need to leave for another class or meeting. But before we do, I'd like to ask those of you who are online and those of you who are here to give a round of applause too. And if you can stay for a few more minutes, it looks like there are a few more questions. Professor Wanko is there. So I hope you can stay for a few more.
Yes, I'm happy to. So yeah. Cheryl?
Thanks. I just wanted to acknowledge that, what happens often in the Brandywine Project with faculty is that even now, they come in with the idea of sustainability is climate change and recycling, that kind of stuff. And then, as you know, Aliza, we get responses like, oh, social justice is part of like a sustainability effort, right? And so I'm wondering if the way the survey was set up to like really focus on climate change and the physical stuff like energy and kind of the environmentally related actions, if you think that had an effect on the self-reporting about how well people felt that they were informed on sustainability. And also, if we look at the literacy questions, if that kind of skewed in that direction as well.
So yeah, that's a really good question. The first part of it in understanding what actions people are engaging in was right off the bat. So the first questions that folks were, after they didn't inform consent, they were being asked about their sustainable actions. And so the goal of asking them before getting into the literacy assessment would be that it wouldn't be skewed by, it would be hopefully a more true assessment of their level of sustainable activity. Then from moving in there, that you get into the Yale climate questions, and then you move into essentially the questions that are on the literacy assessment. And some of the questions on the literacy assessment, like even the first one, is the definition of sustainability, which highlights the social, economic, and environmental. One of the questions I didn't show, and again, this one's really messy too, is that it shows that the United Nations has 17 interrelated goals for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which 4 are most important to you. And that was also like an ability to get a nod into the fact that it spans the social, the economic, and the environmental. But then some of the literacy assessment questions tie into social equity, tied into environmental justice. So it was meant to be a balanced assessment, not overly environmental, and to be able to be reflective of the way that we conceptualize also of sustainability. So potentially looking at the sustainable development goals ahead of taking the literacy assessment might have some relationship there. Did I answer all of your points there?
Yeah, I just wonder if like out in the classes, right? If a student like is reporting on their education and they're saying, I didn't learn anything about climate change, so I didn't learn anything about sustainability, you know, I mean, so it's hard just to get from a survey, oh, I should be thinking about the social stuff too, if that hasn't been like focused on or emphasized in their, you know, in their women's studies class or whatever. So yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, so
Great.
and then so the UN goals, like looking over all the UN goals, what happened before you were asked if you formally studied sustainability, and the question was broad. It was sustainability, the climate crisis, and or global warming. So it was really meant to be as inclusive as possible. But you're right, if it was particular about social justice and not mentioning that by name, potentially somebody might overlook that by not thinking that this truly connects to sustainability, you know, and equity. So yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, Sean.
I just have one more thing I wanted to offer, only because it's the last one. I want to soak it up. I just wonder if there was a way to kind of change the format of the way we do things in terms of all events sustainability related that happen in Westchester. And there is a variety, and they happen in great number, from my experience. But if we were to think about cherry picking, maybe like, or just like going through the survey and taking the questions, overarching questions that we felt like really encompass people's understanding of what sustainability is, and use that as a format to, when we host an event, we can spend about 5 minutes collecting data, even if those events happen several times during the semester. And that would be a way that you could gauge people's, awareness, continued awareness. If we could integrate a small amount of data collection into these events that we spend a lot of time and effort promoting and facilitating, I feel like it's going to be really helpful in the long run. Just changing the format. Again, you really want to, you've done such great work on the survey already. You went back through and looked at, maybe it's the top 5 that you think are like the broad overarching ones that capture what we're in essence trying to understand. And we integrate that into the way we facilitate the events. That it might be helpful to give us some useful long-term data.
So I think that's an interesting idea. My main caveat to that is that there's definitely a selection effect on who shows up to a sustainability event. So if you were saying like, let's go to, for example, the stadium, or like, let's go to the Ramboree or Banana Day and canvas there, I think that would make a lot more sense to me, because we would want to make sure that there's an equal likelihood of, basically our respondents not exclusively already being interested in sustainability, which might skew our findings there. So I think that maybe in-person events has a really good way of being able to, survey more regularly. I would be a little hesitant, unless it could be quite useful to have the information and feedback from participants at an event, but I'd be a little bit more hesitant to do that in this type of regard, because my goal is to not just get the folks that are essentially taking the time out of their day to go to a sustainability focused event, but the folks that aren't, right? And this data still can be skewed by the folks that are just more interested in taking a survey on sustainability than the folks that wouldn't be. But the survey was made available to every single person on campus on multiple different occasions. And so you'd hope that it would hopefully target some folks that are just not interested in that. So yeah.
Well, we're a little past 1, so we probably should end it for today and for the semester. Thank you, Aliza.
Sure.
And thank you to those of you who have joined us today and throughout the semester.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks for everyone for attending. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, take care.